Hello, namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. They say truth is stranger than fiction. South Korea learned it the hard way. The country known for K-pop, cuisine and cutting-edge technology made headlines for martial law. The president imposed it, the parliament vetoed it, the people protested and the world watched in horror. Why was South Korea pulling off on North and what happens now? On Vantage tonight, we'll bring you the full story. In Syria, it's a deadly cocktail of conflict with forces from Russia, Iran and the US joining the war apart from Assad and the rebels. In Canada, they're still recovering from Donald Trump's remark. He told Justin Trudeau that Canada should become the 51st US state to avoid tariffs. In Punjab, Khalistani terror at the holiest Sikh site, an attack on former Deputy Chief Minister Sukhbir Singh Badal. In the US, the debate over presidential pardons. Will Donald Trump pardon himself next? In Georgia, protests intensify. It's a Russia versus Europe proxy war. In Angola, the first ever US presidential visit. We decode Joe Biden's last-ditch attempt to woo Africa. Why Indigo has sued Mahindra and how some of the trademark battles make no sense at all. And scientists say that they have created an invisibility cloak. We'll discuss the headlines first. India's Foreign Secretary to reportedly visit Dhaka next week. If confirmed, it would be the first major engagement with Bangladesh's interim regime. The reports come amid escalating tensions between Dhaka and Delhi. From attacks on minorities to vandalism of diplomatic missions, the relationship has frayed since Sheikh Hasina's ouster in August. Ukraine detains 16-year-old girl on charges of treason. Kiev accuses her of providing information to Russia. The security service says she was caught while trying to photograph a defense facility. The minor is currently in Ukrainian custody. Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te arrives in the U.S. territory of Guam. It's the second stop on his week-long Pacific tour. Lai's first overseas trip is aimed at shoring up support for Taiwan. It has sparked fierce backlash from China. Russia's central bank chief hints at another rate hike, says could consider raising interest rates before the end of the year. Moscow is grappling with high inflation and falling currency. In October, Russia hiked its interest rates to 21%, the highest since 2003. Namibia elects its first female president. Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah wins 57% of the votes in a disputed election. Her win cements her party's 34-year-old hold on power. Namibia is the second African country after Tanzania to have a female leader. And Tokyo proposes 4-day work week for government staffers. The move is part of a nationwide push to encourage parenthood. Japan has the world's second oldest population and is struggling with a low birth rate. Tokyo thinks a smaller work week will help citizens raise children. The land of K-drama has had a very dramatic day. I'm talking about South Korea. The president declared martial law. His name is Yoon Suk-yeol. He is the director of this drama, and it's ending in an anti-climax for him. He faces an impeachment vote. He will most certainly be ousted unless he resigns himself before that. And all of this has happened in less than 24 hours. It started on television. President Yoon made a sudden appearance. He delivered a surprise late-night address and declared martial law in the country. Take a look.
저는 북한 공산 세력의 위협으로부터
I declare martial law to protect the Free Republic of Korea from the threat of North Korean communist forces.
파렴치한 종북 반국가 세력들을 일거에 척결하고
Yoon said his government was under threat. From whom? North Korean Communist Forces. These are his exact words. North Korean Communist Forces. This is the term that he used for the opposition parties in his country. Yoon said that they were trying to destabilize his government. The situation was grave and so martial law was needed, and I'm quoting again, to crush anti-state forces. But it quickly became clear that this was an exaggeration and an excuse. There was no new threat from North Korea. The issue was domestic politics. So protests began, even as the military was starting to move in to take control of South Korean institutions. Yes, the soldiers smashed windows and entered the parliament building. President Yoon's decree meant that the military was in charge. Political activities and protests were banned. The media came under government control and soldiers were deployed to the National Assembly. That's the parliament of South Korea. We saw helicopters landing on the building's roof and in the premises. But these soldiers faced a pushback. First from the parliament staff and then the South Korean citizens.
밀지 마요. 뭘 끊는 거야? 뭐 하자? 하지 마. 아니, 기자분들 앞으로 가세요. 기자 앞으로 나가세요. 앞으로.
Thousands of people gathered in the parliament. They defied the martial law and started protesting. President Yoon was under fire and the opposition was quick to mobilize.
President Yoon Suk Yeol's illegal, unconstitutional, and anti-citizen declaration of martial law.
And it wasn't just the opposition. Yoon's own party turned against him. Leaders from both ruling and opposition parties rushed to the parliament. They too defied the military and forced their way into the building. Some lawmakers even climbed fences to reach the voting chamber.
당신 뭐 하는 사람이야? 뭘 가져?
By 1 a.m. local time, 190 lawmakers were present in the chamber to put Yoon's decision to vote. The outcome was unanimous. Martial law was struck down. President Yoon's decision was declared null and void.
In accordance with the National Assembly's decision, the president must immediately lift martial law. The declaration of martial law is now invalid.
It was a spectacular failure for Yoon, one that could potentially end his political career. He was desperate to secure power. But what led to this desperation? What drove him to take such an extreme step? Yoon was elected in May 2022. Since then, he's been having a tough time. He doesn't have a parliamentary majority. His wife, the First Lady, is mired in corruption scandals. Yoon was increasingly under pressure and getting weaker by the day. The martial law was an act of desperation. It would have rendered the parliament useless and given Yoon sweeping powers. But the move boomeranged. So what happens now? What happens next? Members of Yoon's cabinet are already offering their resignations. The opposition has issued an ultimatum to the president: resign or we will impeach you. That is their message. Meanwhile, protests are still on across multiple cities in South Korea. Protesters are calling for Yoon's arrest.
계엄을 해제한다 해도
Even if martial law is lifted, he cannot avoid treason charges. It was clearly revealed to the entire nation that President Yoon could no longer run the country normally. He should step down, resign immediately. This is the mandate of the people.
국민의 명령이다.
The impeachment vote is on Friday. If the lawmakers approve the motion, it will go to a constitutional court. A bench of 9 judges will hear this case. 6 of these judges must vote yes for the impeachment to stand. And if that happens, President Yoon will be removed from office. Although he won't be the first president to face impeachment, but his exit could be the most humiliating one yet. We've seen a lot of people asking the same questions. Why did this happen? And how in South Korea? Isn't it supposed to be a stable democracy? We'll try to answer both these questions tonight, and here's the first thing that you need to know. President Yoon is struggling politically. His approval ratings are low, he does not control the parliament, and he is mired in corruption scandals. Instead of riding it out, he chose the nuclear option, a risky and amateur move. Let me take you back to the year 2022. That's when Yoon Suk Yeol won the presidential election in South Korea. He came with an ambitious agenda. Just one problem though, his party did not control the parliament. The opposition Democratic Party held the majority in parliament, meaning President Yoon could not get work done. His policies and his proposals were shot down in parliament. Elections happened again in 2024, and once again the opposition got a majority. So Yoon was reduced to a lame duck president. The opposition would pass their own legislations and Yoon would veto them. He used the veto at least 11 times since taking office. Yesterday, he did allude to this problem. Yoon cited policy paralysis in government. Basically, he was frustrated about being powerless. That was the first factor. The second factor was the corruption scandals. Most of them involve his wife. She's accused of stock manipulation, accepting gifts in exchange for favors, and of election meddling. All of this has dropped Yoon's approval ratings to 25. It was almost 53% after his inauguration, now it's 25%. So to recap, Yoon was stuck and unpopular. A seasoned leader may have rode out the storm or found a tactical solution. But President Yoon is a political novice. He was a prosecutor for most of his life. His first foray into politics was the 2022 presidential election, and clearly the inexperience showed. Which brings us to the second question we are addressing tonight. How did this happen in South Korea? Well, democracy is new in this country. Until the late 1980s, it was ruled by dictators and strongmen. They used to impose martial law regularly. There have been 16 instances since 1948. I know it seems unthinkable in modern-day South Korea, but look at their history. It is riddled with takeovers, assassinations, and crackdowns. The first military coup was in 1961. Army officer Park Chung-hee led soldiers into Seoul. He declared martial law and banned political activities. Park went on to rule for almost 20 years. The second coup was in 1979, less than 2 months after Park's death. Another general led soldiers and tanks into Seoul. That's 2 military takeovers in 7 decades. Even otherwise, South Korea's presidents have had troubled careers. Some have been overthrown, some have been jailed, a couple have been impeached, and one died by suicide. A lot of these presidents turned to martial law. Most of them gave the same reason as President Yoon: a supposed communist threat from North Korea. Now, we're not saying that Pyongyang is not a problem, but the last threat we saw was poop-filled balloons flying over the border. I'm sure that does not merit a martial law. And I know this one lasted only 6 hours, but for a lot of people it was traumatic because it brought back memories. They know what comes after martial law is declared. Critics get rounded up, politicians get arrested, protesters are brutally silenced. That's what happened in 1960. Korean students were protesting against South Korea's first president. He used martial law to suppress them. More than 180 people were killed in the crackdown that followed. The same thing happened in 1980. Citizens in the city of Gwangju protested against the president. In response, martial law was declared and some 200 people were killed. There are very painful memories for South Koreans here, and yesterday they briefly relived it.
Last night, I happened to wake up from my sleep and came across the news. At first, I was scared and very confused. I kept thinking, what is going on? Is this something that could actually happen in this era? I couldn't sleep until the martial law was lifted because I was so frightened.
It was an experience that I've only seen in movies, and I realized how much more serious it is than I had imagined. The current economic condition is difficult, and the fact that the president is causing such anxiety among residents makes the situation so much worse.
But credit to them because they fought to protect their freedoms. Even in the dead of the night, they turned up. Protesters blocked military vehicles, opposition parties mobilized, and even Yoon's own lawmakers stood up to him. Clearly, South Korea was not about to hit rewind. Credit also to Korean officials. Until the 1980s, martial law could be declared unilaterally. No parliament approval was required. Korean politicians added that clause in the 80s. And that's how this crisis was averted. I wish I could say all's well that ends well. But this is a warning to South Korea and all other democracies. Never take your freedoms for granted. And keep strengthening your laws and institutions because leaders like Yoon will always exist. Our best option is to be alert and build guardrails. Now let's shift our focus to Syria. The conflict against the Assad regime has intensified. Today, the Syrian army launched a counter-attack. They're trying to push back the rebels who are challenging Bashar al-Assad. He is the president of Syria. His forces are going after rebel groups, and caught in the crossfire, as always, are civilians.
شباب المشفى 2/12 2024 اللحظات الأولى 2/12/2024 لحظة استهداف الطيران الحربي لدمشق الجانب.
Those pictures are from a hospital in Idlib. It's a city in northwest Syria, a rebel stronghold. Russia has been bombing them. What you saw was the impact of Russian bombs. More than 24 civilians have died. Reports say the fighting has intensified in the last 24 hours. The rebels have captured at least 4 new towns. They're advancing towards Hama, a city in central Syria. But taking Hama is going to be difficult because here Assad's forces are pushing back hard, and aiding them is aerial support from allies like Russia. This conflict flared up last week, but it has been on for more than 13 years now. The Syrian civil war broke out in the year 2011. It began as an uprising against the Assad regime and morphed into a complex conflict. By 2014, multiple international powers were involved and terror groups exploited the chaos. That's when ISIS, or the Islamic State, took shape and captured territory. Soon ISIS became enemy number 1 for Assad. It hijacked the popular rebellion against the president, and it took 5 years of fighting to beat the ISIS. But peace was not restored in Syria. It still remains in a state of turmoil. The government does not control the entire country. There are regions where rebel groups hold sway, and they keep launching offensives against Damascus. The latest offensive was launched by a group called HTS, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It split from the Al-Qaeda in 2016. Since then, it has grown both in resources and numbers. The group has recruited other opposition forces, and it is now testing Assad's grip on power. This escalation will draw in regional players like Iran. Tehran is a key backer of Bashar al-Assad. When rebels took control of Aleppo earlier this week, Tehran responded swiftly. Their foreign minister flew down to Damascus, the Syrian capital. Iran also sent militia forces to support the Assad regime. And now Tehran is considering direct involvement. It says it is ready to send Iranian troops in Syria. Their foreign minister has said this, the Iranian foreign minister. He says that if Assad sends a request for troops, Tehran would consider it. Iran's arch rival is also being pulled into the conflict. I'm talking about the United States of America. The US carried out a strike yesterday. They're calling it, the Americans are calling it, a self-defense strike. They have a military base in eastern Syria. It's called Euphrates, like the river Euphrates. American forces say their military base came under attack. Rockets fell near it and mortars were fired at American forces.
We're still assessing who is operating these weapons, but do know that there are Iranian-backed militia groups in the area that have conducted attacks on MSS Euphrates in the past. There are also Syrian military forces that operate in the area.
So who was operating these weapons? Washington did not say who was behind the attack, but both Assad's forces and Iranian fighters operate in this area, so it could have been any or both of them. The Americans neutralized multiple rocket launchers, mortars, and a military tank deployed near their base, so they're clearly stepping into this conflict. And when the Americans enter, how can the Russians stay on the sidelines? Just like Iran, Russia is a key ally of Assad. It has provided military support to the regime since 2015. Last week, when the clashes with rebels broke out, the Russian Air Force was pressed into service. Moscow is pledging unconditional support to Assad. It is also using this conflict to gain diplomatic edge. Russia has also made a big claim. It says the Ukrainians are supporting the rebels in Syria.
Obviously, there was a so-called Ukrainian trace, given the incoming information about the interaction of the Kiev regime's special services with the militants of the terrorist organization Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, including the transfer of drones, experience in their use, and so on. This is not the first and, unfortunately, as we understand, not the last region where the Kiev terrorist regime will apply its criminal experience. Before this, there were African countries. Now we are talking about Syria.
We cannot independently verify any of these claims, but what's undeniable is the rapid escalation of this war. West Asia has been going through a dangerous phase of never-ending conflicts. It started in Gaza, it spread to Lebanon, and now it has spilled into Syria, where rivals like the US, Russia, and Iran are already locked in a dangerous game. West Asia is teetering on the edge. If Syria becomes the epicenter, the consequences could ripple across the region, and the already fragile West Asia may not be able to withstand the fallout. Yesterday's joke on the show was about Justin Trudeau, on how Trump taunted him. Trudeau was in Florida to meet the president-elect. He wanted to discuss tariffs with Donald Trump, but Trump refused to budge. He delivered a joke/insult to the Canadian Prime Minister. Trump said to Trudeau, if you can't pay the tariff, just join the United States, become our 51st state. Apparently, Trudeau laughed nervously at this. His ministers also called it a joke. But with Donald Trump, who knows? This is a man who tried to buy Greenland from Denmark, who suggested drinking bleach to cure the Wuhan virus, so nothing is off the table. Trump also posted this picture on social media. It's an AI-generated image. It shows him standing over Canadian mountain ranges. And look at the caption, "Oh, Canada." Could Donald Trump be hinting at something here? Well, his joke does have some history. There's a Wikipedia page on Canada joining the US. A few Canadian parties have pushed for this merger, but none of them really took off. Today, there is no appetite for such a move. The mere suggestion is controversial, and you can see why. America is a very powerful neighbor to have. Their economy, their military, their culture, all of it looms large over Canada. And financially, they are dependent on the US. Nearly 75% of Canada's exports go to just one country, and that is the United States. Even politically, there's alignment on NATO, on West Asia, on Europe, on the Indo-Pacific. Their foreign policies often mirror each other. Add to that a massive border. It's almost 9,000 kilometers long. It's the longest international border in the world, the US and Canada. Most Canadians live near this region. The north is too cold and often uninhabitable, so 80% of all Canadians live within 160 kilometers of the US border. Hence this worry of being gobbled up by the US. And it's not a recent concern. It dates back to the 18th century, to the Revolutionary War against Britain, sort of like America's war for independence. During this war, the US Army tried to invade Canada. Back then, Canada was occupied by Britain, so British soldiers beat them back. Another attempt was made through America's first constitution. It was adopted in 1777, and it invited Canada to join the United States. No strings attached. But again, the British rulers rejected it. Years later, in 1812, the US invaded again, and once again the British beat them back. They also burnt the White House for good measure, which pretty much settled the debate. But in the 1980s, it emerged once again. The reason was not an invasion or a political document, it was a free trade agreement. Canada and the US were discussing a trade deal in 1988. Canada's Conservative Party supported this deal, but the Liberal Party did not. That's the party of the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. It was led by a politician named John Turner back then. He said a trade deal would dilute Canada's sovereignty, that it would eventually reduce Canada to the 51st state of America. Listen to this.
I will not let this great nation surrender its birthright. I believe that Canadians are not going to vote for Brian Mulroney, a man who would be governor of a 51st state. They are going to vote for John Turner, a man who wants to be Prime Minister of Canada.
A lot of people shared this view, including the New Democrat Party, which is the party of Jagmeet Singh. So did a number of activists and political commentators. But the Conservatives prevailed in 1988. They signed that free trade agreement with Washington, D.C. And as it turned out, Canada is still a country. But let's come to present day. Donald Trump's joke about Canada is not new. His advisors say that he used the same line in his first term as well. He also followed that up with tariffs. Back then, Justin Trudeau responded in kind. He imposed tit-for-tat tariffs on US imports. But this time, he's a lot weaker. If not, he could have actually stood his ground. I mean, just look at the numbers. The Canadian border made up just 0.08% of all drug seizures by US officials. Only 0.08%. Same with illegal migrants. American officials caught 23,000 migrants at the Canadian border for the entire year. 23,000, which makes up just 1.4% of the total. So the fact is that Trump is exaggerating the threat from Canada. His tariff threat is simply unfair. But to question that, you need strong footing. You need a decisive and a popular leader. You also need a diversified economy that can sustain pressure. Canada does not have any of that. What they do have is Justin Trudeau. Unless Canadian exporters start talking about Khalistan, don't bet on him to protect them. Speaking of Khalistanis, they nearly struck again in India. That too, at one of the holiest sites in the country, the Golden Temple in Amritsar. The target was Sukhbir Singh Badal. He is the leader of the Shiromani Akali Dal, which is a political party in the state of Punjab. He is also a former Deputy Chief Minister of the same state. We'll get to more details in a bit, but first, look at how the attack unfolded. It doesn't get closer than that. The attacker managed to take out the gun. He also pointed it at Sukhbir Singh Badal, but his security detail intervened at just the right moment. As a result, the gunman could only fire into the air. First of all, kudos to that official. His quick response avoided bloodshed. And what about the gunman? He was apprehended by the crowd. He was handed to the police. His identity has now been revealed. His name is Narayan Singh Chora, a 68-year-old Khalistani. In the 1970s, he was a student at the Sikh Missionary College in Amritsar. That's where he was reportedly radicalized. In 1982, he founded the Akal Federation, which was a group of Khalistani hardliners. And in 1984, he traveled to Pakistan. This was after the military operation at the Golden Temple. Indian officials say Chora was trained in Pakistan. He went on to form the Khalistan National Army. He was also linked to Babbar Khalsa International. Now, both of these are terror groups. From Pakistan, he smuggled weapons and explosives into India. And in the 1990s, he returned to Punjab. From there, he took part in militant activities again. And I know what you're thinking at this point. How was this man not in jail? Well, he was. Chora has served multiple stints in prison. in 1995, in 2004, and then again in 2013. He has faced charges of terrorism and waging war against the state, yet each time he was acquitted. Chaura does have more cases pending against him, but he was released on bail in 2022. Now, this whole episode raises a number of questions, like why did the charges against Chaura never stick? And why wasn't Badal better protected? This is a leader with Z+ security cover, that's the highest that India can offer, Z+, yet an assassin simply walked up to him. Plus, Badal's visit was not out of the blue. He was at the Golden Temple for a religious commitment. Sikh authorities had asked him to serve punishment. Punishment for what? For mistakes committed when his party was in power. That's from 2007 to 2017. So Sukhbir Singh Badal had to stand guard outside the temple. That was his religious punishment. Everyone in the media and the state knew about it. Yet the security breach happened. So government officials do have some answers to give. Secondly, it's another reminder of the Khalistan threat. Granted, we don't know the gunman's motives, but he was a Khalistani, that too an allegedly reformed one. That's right. Of late, Chaura was not involved in militant activities. He was more involved in political and social campaigns. Yet today he picked up the gun. It confirms what we've been saying for a while now. Do not ignore violent rhetoric. Do not underestimate these so-called activists. That's what we see in the West. Their governments do not act against Khalistani statements or threats. They will only act after a tragedy unfolds. As this incident shows, that's the wrong approach. The cops have promised to explore every single angle in this case. There is also some talk of a Pakistani hand, so we'll be tracking the updates closely for you. Can Donald Trump pardon himself? It's the new hot question in Washington. You see, this week, Joe Biden used his presidential powers to pardon his son, Hunter Biden. He had 2 criminal cases against him. They are gone now thanks to his father, the president. And this has raised a question. When Trump becomes president, can he pardon himself? He has 34 felony convictions. In fact, he is the first convicted felon to become the US president. Some of those cases are already being dropped, but others still loom. So can Donald Trump use his presidential pardon to make them go away? And will he be the first president to do so? Our next report tells you.
The year was 1974. Richard Nixon was the United States president.
I have made many speeches in my life.
The Watergate scandal had overshadowed his presidency, and he had no option but to resign. So Nixon pondered upon an important question. Can he pardon himself? Can he absolve himself of all the crimes he was accused of? His own Justice Department gave him the answer. It was a resounding no. Nixon ended up resigning just 4 days later. He did eventually get the pardon, but it came from his successor, Gerald Ford. 50 years later, the same question is haunting Washington once again. Donald Trump is set to take office about 6 weeks from now. He's the first convicted felon to be elected president. Trump has 34 felony convictions. He's charged with fraud and election subversion. There were 2 federal criminal cases against him, and those are being wrapped up. That's because he now has presidential immunity. But there are still ongoing cases in states, namely in New York and Georgia. So the question is, can he pardon himself in these cases?
Because we have a corrupt district attorney.
Let's look at the presidential pardon first. The idea was derived from the pardon power of English kings. The US founding fathers pushed for this power to be included in the Constitution. There was some debate on whether the Congress should have it or if there should be exceptions. But finally, the US Constitution granted the president broad powers to issue a pardon. This in all cases except for impeachment. Any presidential pardon includes legal forgiveness and prevents any further punishment. George Washington issued the first pardons in 1795. Since then, US presidents from both parties have issued multiple pardons. It was mainly used for people close to them, like Joe Biden, who issued a presidential pardon for his son, Hunter. Hunter Biden was facing sentencing for 2 criminal cases, and this pardon grants him a reprieve for the future. So US presidents are no stranger to this power. But Trump's case is a little different. Can a US president pardon himself? Can Trump make the cases in New York and Georgia go away? Well, there's no such precedent, and no US president has ever pardoned himself. There is no mention of it in explicit terms. The US Constitution mentions the president as acting as a judge. So legal experts are unclear on how self-pardons would work or whether they would be permissible in the first place. But Trump's problems are a little bigger than that. The presidential pardon may be sweeping, but its powers are not limitless. A president can only issue pardons for federal crimes. He cannot pardon himself in state-level cases, like Trump's hush money case in New York. Both New York and Georgia seem unwilling to drop the cases. At best, they can be paused until he leaves office. During his previous term, Trump's lawyer Rudy Giuliani said he could probably pardon himself. But Trump has denied it. Before the elections, he said that it's very unlikely that he would pardon himself. As he takes office once again, the United States is entering uncharted territory. A president leading the nation while fighting legal wars on multiple fronts. Donald Trump may not be able to pardon himself, but he won't be the first president to think about it.
Now let's turn our attention to Georgia, a country of less than 4 million people, which is witnessing dangerous but momentous times. Tensions have been brewing for months due to a widening political rift between the pro-Russian government and pro-Western Georgians. About 80% Georgians want their country to be part of the European Union. Last year, Georgia became a candidate for EU membership, but last week, their government suspended plans for the membership, and clashes broke out. For 6 nights in a row, tens of thousands of Georgians have converged on the parliament and the police have cracked down. But protests are only growing. Nearly 300 protesters have been detained so far and an opposition leader has been arrested. But neither side plans to back down. Is there a way out of this constitutional crisis? Here's a report.
This is Rustaveli Avenue, the broad central avenue that runs past the Georgian parliament in the capital Tbilisi. Night after night, it has been flooded with tens of thousands of people, so much so that there's barely space to move. People are coming draped in flags, the blue and gold of the European Union and the red and white of the St. George's Cross. Whistling, clapping, blowing vuvuzelas, cracking fireworks. Just as riot police pushed back the protesters converged on the parliament using water cannons and tear gas. And according to Georgia's public rights defender, even brutality. So far, nearly 300 protesters have been detained, and 26, including 3 police officers, have been hospitalized with injuries. But the protesters refuse to back down.
We won't be tired. No matter that they are beating us down, no matter that they are chasing us down in the underground and even in the block of the buildings, to tell the truth, but we won't be tired. Unless we get whatever we want, and that's the part to be part of the EU.
Demonstrations have continued for 6 nights in a row as the result of a widening political rift between the country's pro-Russian government and those who want closer ties with the West. The governing Georgian Dream Party retained control of parliament in the disputed October 26th election. The opposition and the pro-Western president accused the party of rigging the vote with neighboring Russia's help. Last week, on Thursday, the European Parliament made an announcement. They adopted a non-binding resolution rejecting Georgia's parliamentary elections. They called for fresh elections and sanctions on Georgian leaders. Hours later, the Georgian Dream Party made an announcement. They suspended negotiations on joining the European Union, saying that EU membership talks would be on hold until 2028 and accusing the EU of blackmail. The goal of joining the EU was enshrined in Georgia's constitution in the year 2017. Georgia applied to be a part of the EU in 2022. They became a candidate for EU membership in 2023. According to polls, about 80% of all Georgians want their country to become an EU member. So, on the same day, people took to the streets to protest the delay, venting their outrage. On Sunday, Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze said that parliamentary elections would not be re-held. This further intensified the protests, but Kobakidze remains undeterred. He has doubled down on his stance for no negotiations with the EU and clamped down on protests.
So the attempt to organize the Maidan in Georgia is already over. I would call everybody to keep quiet, let's say, and to keep peace in this country.
Meanwhile, protesters are standing their ground as well, spurred on by the figurehead president.
The clear message is again non-recognition of the elections and support to the new elections, because that is the political way out of this crisis.
I think it's a duty of all citizens to stand here. I think the only solution of this political crisis is a fair election.
So, what's next for Georgia? Will the government back down, or will the protests fizzle out under pressure? The only way out of this constitutional crisis, it seems, is if one side blinks first.
Our next story is from Africa, from the nation of Angola in the south. Angola is hosting a special guest, US President Joe Biden. It is Biden's first visit to Africa during his presidency. In fact, it's the first African trip by a US president since 2015. That's when Barack Obama went to Kenya and Ethiopia. And this is the first ever that an American president is visiting Angola. So a lot of firsts here. Biden got to Angola on Monday and he's been getting the red carpet treatment. It's a state visit with full honors. Yesterday, Biden met his Angolan counterpart, President João Lourenço. There was a lot of focus on this particular moment when the Angolan president grabbed Biden's arm and helped him up onto a raised platform. There was a usual backlash to this. But is it really surprising anymore? He's about to retire in 50-odd days, so is this really a big deal? Instead, let's focus on the trip for the moment. Why Angola? And why now, so close to the end of Biden's tenure? Well, part of it is a last-ditch attempt to impress Africa.
You've heard me say it before, Mr. President. The United States is all in on Africa. All in on Africa.
Biden had been promising to go to Africa for years, but something always came up. Now that he's on his way out of the White House, it seems he's finally found time. He's in Angola to do a bit of last-minute African appeasement.
And today, I'm announcing over $1 billion in new humanitarian support for Africans displaced from homes by historic droughts and food insecurity.
Maybe he thinks giving money will make up for failing to visit sooner, that he may be able to buy America's way into Africa's good books. Let's see if that works. But that's just one reason for the visit. The main focus of Biden's trip is a US-financed rail project.
It's called the Libido Corridor. We're building railroad lines from Angola to the port of Libido in Zambia and the DRC, and ultimately all the way to the Atlantic, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. It'll be the first transcontinental railroad in Africa and the biggest American rail investment outside of America.
Lobito is a port in Angola on the Atlantic coast. It could become a gateway for exports to the Americas. That's the plan anyway. And what do they plan to export from here? Mineral wealth from Central Africa. Beyond Angola, you have Zambia and the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Both nations have resources like copper and cobalt. Copper has multiple uses. Cobalt is essential for electric vehicle batteries. The US wants both these minerals and anything else that they can get from Central Africa. Currently, it's difficult to transport these minerals. It takes days to bring them from Central Africa to a port. But that's where the Lobito corridor comes in. The US-financed railways will speed up the transport of minerals and make exporting them more efficient. The corridor will give the US a direct pipeline to Africa's mineral wealth. Biden has been championing this project for years. His administration has pumped in $4 billion already, and he's not done yet. He now wants to accelerate the next phase of the corridor. It's a railway line connecting Zambia to Lobito. Biden wants to facilitate this next phase, so he co-hosted a summit today with Angola's President Lourenço. They invited the leaders of Zambia, the DRC and Tanzania. They're really making a hard sell here. But why does Joe Biden want this corridor so bad? To counter Chinese influence in Africa. Beijing has been investing in such projects for years. It has invested in African mining operations. It has spent billions in Tanzanian ports and railways. All of this is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. The US is lagging far behind. But it still wants to try and compete because it has an ace up its sleeve. Yesterday, Biden said, and I'm quoting, "We've also pushed to ensure that developing nations do not have to choose between paying down unsustainable debt and being able to invest in their own people." Unsustainable debt, you know, he's talking about China and Beijing's debt trap diplomacy. Everything China has done in Africa comes at a price. The debt has led to ballooning payments and sometimes outright defaults. Zambia defaulted on its debt in 2020, and now Joe Biden is quoting the very same country. Clearly, the US is trying to wean African nations away from China. But will the Lobito corridor be enough to convince them? Or is it too little too late? We'll find out in the months ahead. In the world of business, a name is more than just a name. It's an identity, a promise, and more importantly, a trademark. But what happens when two companies claim the same identity? They go to war. Take Indigo, for example. It's India's largest airline by fleet size. It controls 63% of the market share, and now it has filed a case against Mahindra Electric Automobile Limited, the EV subsidiary of automaker Mahindra. And why is an airline suing an automaker? Indigo says it's about trademark infringement. The bone of contention is a two-character code, 6E. You see, 6E is Indigo's call sign. That means all Indigo flights are identified by this code, 6E, plus it is part of their overall branding. There are 6E menus for flights, 6E experiences, 6E loyalty programs. Basically, 6E is the cornerstone of Indigo's branding. The airline secured this trademark in 2015. It allows Indigo to use 6E for various purposes. And where does Mahindra come in? On November 26, they launched two new EV cars in India, Mahindra XEV9E and Mahindra BE6E. Now, Indigo has a problem with the second one because it uses 6E. Indigo says this infringes on its already established trademark. So the airline has moved court. And what does Mahindra have to say? The automaker says its branding is BE6E and not 6E alone. Plus, it has already registered BE6E as a trademark, so Mahindra has the right to use it for its vehicles. The next hearing is on December 9th. We don't know how the case will play out, but Mahindra's argument is quite simple. There is no conflict of interest. One is an airline, the other is an electric vehicle. It's not like customers will be confused, which seems like a fair point. But this is not the first such case. Across industries, companies battle fiercely to protect their trademarks, even from unrelated businesses. Take Louis Vuitton, for example. It's a luxury fashion house. In 2015, they sued a South Korean fried chicken restaurant. Why? Because of its name, Louis Vuitton Duck. Now, LV said the name dilutes their brand. It's absurd. High fashion versus fried chicken. But apparently, brand reputation is everything, and Louis Vuitton ended up winning this case. The owner of this restaurant had to pay them. Then in 2023, another bizarre case came up. Energy drink company Monster Energy sued Pokemon in Japan. The lawsuit was against the use of the word monster. You see, Pokemon is an abbreviation. The full form is Pocket Monsters. In Japan, the franchise goes by its full name. Monster Energy had a problem with that. It said people may confuse Pokemon with their company. Again, weird logic. And obviously, it did not fly in Japan. Japanese officials rejected this claim. And if you thought this was weird, look at the next one. In 2004, Microsoft filed a trademark complaint against a teenager, a teen named Mike Rowe. M-I-K-E-R-O-W-E, Mike Rowe. He had set up a website, mikerowesoft.com. It was a pun on his name, but the tech giant was not amused. They said the phonetic resemblance infringed its trademark. The case was settled outside court. But it shows you how far companies go to protect their brands. We say if they spent half as much energy and effort to improve their products, the consumers would be happier. Do you know anyone who flies Indigo because their branding is 6E? Consumers want flights on time, clean seats, decent food, and supportive staff, 6E or not. And trademarks were designed to protect brands from unfair competition. And yes, companies must protect their trademarks, but how far is too far? Battles over trademark often lead to aggressive enforcement, even in cases that seem trivial. Companies may win the battle in court, but they often don't play out well in the court of public opinion. If you are a Homo sapien, in all likelihood you're obsessed with at least one of these: anti-aging, the Roman Empire, or invisibility. If you fall in the last category, there is good news for you. Now you may be able to give Harry Potter solid competition because scientists have developed an invisibility cloak. It is a material that can camouflage items, basically make them invisible. So how does it work? What can it be used for? We'll tell you what scientists say, what the internet hopes for, and what invisibility-obsessed pop culture awaits. Here's a report.
It is possible to be invisible. Historically, that's what many people have claimed, including British polymath John Aubrey. In the 1680s, he came up with the perfect recipe for invisibility. So, fellow invisibility seeker, all you have to do is acquire the severed head of a man, add exactly 7 black beans, pour over some brandy, and bury the severed head. 7 days later, pick out one of those sprouted beans, eat it, and voila, you're invisible. How exactly will you know? Hopefully, you'll feel magical and look see-through. Or you can punch someone you hate and let the repercussions give you an answer. But if you don't have 7 days to wait and don't hate yourself completely, Chinese scientists just might have a solution. Yes, anything that comes from a Chinese lab can stir some doubts. But according to a study, researchers have hacked invisibility. They've developed a material that can camouflage. It can blend into the environment. This technology can be applied to clothing, containers, films, and even spray coatings. So how exactly does it work? The material can change its color at a molecular level. This will blend whatever is underneath into its environment, by proxy making the object or person invisible. In nature, the chameleon and octopus rely on this method to camouflage. This material will perform a similar extravaganza of obscurity. Scientists are excited about its potential applications, from stealth military technology to fashion and architecture design. Sure, these are fascinating potential uses, but what's even better? It gives superhero wannabes some much-needed hope. Invisibility looms large in the kingdom of childhood fantasy. It rarely gets adult scrutiny, yet it's among the top 5 most desired superpowers and has captured human fascination for thousands of years. Around the 1st century, the Greek wrote about the god of the underworld, Hades, and his cap of invisibility. This became fodder for modern writers, like The Invisible Man, published in 1897, the grim tale of a scientist who becomes invisible and is beaten to death. Then came a string of books and movies, with cool gadgets, of course. The Lord of the Rings in the 1950s with the Invisibility Ring, Mr. India's Invisibility Watch in 1987, Harry Potter's Invisibility Cloak a decade later, and the Bond Aston Martin that turns invisible in 2002. Because after gods, ghosts, demons, superheroes, X-rays and dark matter, how could James Bond not tap into all the things we can't see and imagine? The question is, why do we expend so much imagination in trying to join them? And what would we do if we could? The options are endless, at least according to Know-It-All Reddit. If invisible, one user wants to start a cult. Another user wants to steal people's keys and misplace them. And another user wants to make someone believe that they have telekinetic abilities which somehow stop working every time they try to show them to someone else. Visibly, some people just want to watch the world burn.
Two things happened when South Korea declared martial law. First, the people hit the streets, and second, ex-users became Korean experts. Not surprising, but I was impressed by the quick turnaround. I mean, Syria expert on Monday and Korea expert on Tuesday. It was indeed a very quick update of the Twitter bio. But for South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, what a disappointment. I can understand failing to pull off a coup when you're in the opposition. But how do you mess up a self-coup? It's a crime that can get you court-martialed from the Pakistan army. That's how efficient they are. And I know these are tense times for South Koreans, but a 6-hour crisis is a joke waiting to be written, so the internet obliged.
I declare martial law to protect the Free Republic of Korea from the threat of North Korean Communist forces. I will accept the National Assembly's demand and lift martial law through a cabinet meeting.
Now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. The Chinese Coast Guard nearly crashes into Philippine patrol vessels, hitting them with water cannons. India marks Navy Day with a mega operational demonstration in Odisha. And the UK's King Charles hosts a lavish banquet for Qatar's Emir. Finally, we are taking you back in history. On this day in 1943, General Tito was named as head of the Provisional Communist Government in Yugoslavia. He was the first communist leader in power to defy Soviet hegemony. Under Tito's leadership, Yugoslavia became a founding member of the non-aligned movement. He later became the first Secretary General of NAM. We're leaving you on that note. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Bro. This plan creating a terrorist. CCG 6 o'clock. This plan creating a terrorist.